Is it 2018 already? Postdoc, the New Orleans ACS meeting is coming up. I need data. Again. Yeah, I got a little bit of data to present, but you know, I really need some new equipment. New equipment. Well, time to make it rain.
Damn. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Woo! Nice. This is awesome. You have no excuses now.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, everybody. Welcome. Give me a moment to get everything set up here. First things first, as you can see, my esteemed colleague Alex is not with me today, unfortunately. So I will be doing this by myself. But in any case, welcome everyone to another episode of Pine Research's Ask Us Anything About Electrochemistry live stream. Somebody in the chat, as soon as you hear this, please type in that you hear me. That's always the first thing, just to make sure that the audio is working. And I'll get through a few logistical things here before we get to the various questions that I do see a few, and there were some posted earlier as well. But as I said, welcome everybody. This is live stream Q&A by Pine Research. I'm your host, Dr. Neil Spinner. As I said, my colleague and co-host, Dr. Alex Peroff, is out today. So it's just me. And the goal of this office hours live stream, ask us anything kind of video is to answer questions that anybody might have. We get a lot of questions as an electrochemistry company on YouTube videos and webinars that I've done, phone calls, emails, things like that. And so this is a hopefully nice way and venue for you to join and ask questions live, and hopefully not test my knowledge too bad. If I will do my best to answer any questions that you all have, and we'll go from there. So just a few things, as you've noticed here. I'm going to start answering questions, but just so you're aware, this is being streamed on Zoom, and there is about a 20-second delay. So when you type something, I see it immediately, but there will be about 20 seconds between when you type it and when you would hear me say something about it, just because of that delay. So just be aware of that. If it seems like I'm not getting to questions, believe me, I do see them. And the other part is I appreciate your patience, because sometimes it's electrochemistry, so questions take a few minutes to answer sometimes, and I will get to as many as I can. So even if your question gets scrolled up in the chat by a bit, I will certainly do my best to get to it. If you're watching this live stream recording after the fact and you're not with us live, you can feel free to put a comment on the video, and we will answer it just as we would live, but of course after the fact. But anyway, I appreciate anybody who's also watching the recording of this live stream afterwards. We also want to give a shout out to our members on our YouTube channel. We really appreciate you very much. Thank you very much for being a member. And for those who might be members or thinking of being members, we do try to give priority to questions by our YouTube channel members. So if you are a member and you ask a question, I will typically try to answer that question first. I also just wanted to give two other little bits of information here. The first is that, just as a general rule, electrochemistry is difficult. We're well aware of that. And I just want to be encouraging. If you have a question that maybe you feel embarrassed to ask, or aren't sure if it's a dumb question or something like that, I just want to encourage everybody to feel comfortable and confident. There's no judgment here in electrochemistry. This is hopefully a venue to get some of those questions out, and I will certainly do my best to give as honest and thorough answers as I can. And I just want everybody to feel comfortable to be able to ask what they wish to ask in this live stream. And then the other part is that, for sure, I apologize in advance if I mispronounce anybody's name. So, okay, let's get right to it. So the first thing I wanted to get to was actually, as perhaps anybody who is here who posted questions earlier in the week. So I posted this event on our YouTube channel as a scheduled event, 4 or 5 days ago. And so there were some questions that I saw, and YouTube does this weird thing, which I've not been able to figure out exactly why it does it or how to do anything about it. It seems like it's a YouTube thing. It's not anything that I have control over, but when you type a question into like a scheduled event, it just goes away after like a day. And I have no idea why. So I can't keep it there. So what I've been doing is, because I know this now, when I've scheduled these events, and they're typically every Friday at this time, which is 1 o'clock Eastern, US Eastern time, I'm checking the scheduled event every day and copying down the questions so I can answer them later, because if you ask them and then they disappear after a day, well, what good is that? So I'm making sure that I note down any questions that anybody asks, and I've done just that. So there was a series of questions by someone named Noah Elashiri, and they posted these a couple of days ago. So I don't know if you are watching or not, or perhaps you'll see this later, but I would like to address these questions since technically they were chronologically first. So the first question says, I watched your last video about EIS, but I still can't understand how to use this technology in corrosion measurement. So I will bring up a few things here. So first of all, you can absolutely use impedance to do corrosion measurements. Now, one of the more common kinds of applications for corrosion in electrochemistry is called LPR, or linear polarization resistance, which is a DC technique. That being said, there are certainly applications in corrosion studies that can use impedance. I have some references and I have a few things I'll get into a little bit. And one of those actually leads into the second question that this person had that said, what is the transient current technique? And also, how can I use it in corrosion measurement? So I'll address that one as a part answer here. Okay, let me get the transient one. So this is an interesting kind of a technique. Okay, I'm going to share just this paper, and I'll put what I'll do is I'll put the DOI into the chat. So if you're here with me now, or whether you watch this later, hopefully the chat will, you can look at the chat transcript and link to this article. So this is just one particular article about the transient technique for corrosion study. So where's the DOI? Here it is. Let me see if I can copy this and put it into the chat for future reference. So this is transient technique for corrosion. So this is an interesting paper. So effectively, there's a lot of equations here. I won't, get too into the weeds. This is not impedance related, for what it's worth. So that's not the answer to the first question, but the second question about transient technique. So effectively, you're trying to get the corrosion current. It's a function of this beta, this B value, which is related to these Tafel constants, okay? And you're trying to get the resistance as well. So basically, the resistance is Ohm's law. So what people do is called linear polarization resistance. You do a short scan or series of chrono steps to get the slope of current and potential, and then the slope is proportionate to the resistance per Ohm's law. Okay. But this transient technique is a different technique. What they do instead is instead of scanning from like negative to positive or something around OCP, they pick a potential 20 millivolts or something above, they let it settle. And then they pick a potential below and they let it settle. And so what they do is then they see these area SA and SC, they're just integrating the current. So the current versus time plot. So when you integrate that, you get charge, and they add these charges together. Okay, so this is what the transient is. It's trying to take out the effect of like double layer capacitance and things like that. And so you can look at the paper, certain periods of time, effectively, when you average these together, there will be a small difference, either positively or negatively. And that is equated, that difference. Let's see if the equation's in here somewhere. Basically, something like this. You can see what happens is that the SA plus SC, right? That is effectively equated to the charge, the what is it called here? The corrosion charge. Okay, and so this is a version of Faraday's law of electrolysis. Okay, this right here, M is Q times M and F this is Faraday's law basically. And so this transient technique is another way, in addition to linear polarization resistance, to get at the corrosion current, which gets you your corrosion rate, which is sometimes called penetration rate or penetration depth. And it's like how much of your material is decomposing over a period of time. That's all I'll say about the transient technique, so as to not take too much time on that. As far as impedance on corrosion, there are a number of papers that I could cite for you. Let me just maybe pull up one. Let me see. Yeah, this I'll share this one. There's a lot, honestly. A really quick search of the literature, you'll find a lot on impedance of corrosion. So this is a paper from about 10, 11, 12 years ago, something like that. Here you can see just some particular steel alloy N80 and looking at the corrosion. So they did both DC and AC techniques. This is DC, this is polarization curves. Okay, you can get the Tafel constants this way. And they studied the resistance over time. And then you can see some impedance results here. And so how you do impedance on corrosion, well, frankly, it's just another technique you can do just like anything else. Okay. And there's a number of different kinds of analyses, but typically fitting with Randall's elements is acceptable. There are other forms of corrosion where you have this inductive effect. I won't talk too heavily about that unless there's specific questions, again, just to save on a little bit of time. But typically you're looking at the decomposition or capacitive processes with these capacitive CPEs or Randall's elements and seeing how they change over time. I'm going to try to get through the last couple of questions. The third question from this person was, what is the open circuit test? Really, that's a very simple answer. That's when you set your potentiostat to 0 current and measure the voltage or potential response. That's all it is. So you're forcing no current to pass between the working and the counter electrode, and you are measuring what the potential is at that condition. That's what the potential open circuit voltage, that's what that test is. And then the last question was to suggest some simple references about using electrochemistry method in corrosion measurement. So that I just provided one. Again, I showed you this other one here. You can get that reference as well. It's honestly, there are many papers. I mean, if you just go to Google Scholar or you go to an engineering database or a literature database, and you search for impedance, corrosion, you'll find a large amount of papers. I don't have any like specific, other than what I've just shown, like my favorite or the best or something like that. It really depends on what you're studying. You will hopefully find some references, that detail your metal or your particular brine solution or whatever you are, looking at. You can hopefully find some specifics related to that, your system, in the literature. Okay, so I do see there's a few questions from people here live. I see Chelsea has asked, do we have any videos about electrochemistry and corrosion, specifically fuel cells and corrosion? So we do have a few. I'll actually put a few links actually here. We have on our YouTube channel. This one is impedance spectroscopy of a coated steel corrosion. So this is one video for you. And then here's another one that is on, it's actually an electrolyzer, which is like a backwards fuel cell, but it's a similar phenomenon. So those two links that I just put into the chat, and you're probably seeing the links before you're hearing me say this. So again, just be aware of the delay once you hear this. Those are two videos that come from a couple of webinars that I had given in the past. So those are short parts of those analyses. One of them details both of them detailed data that I had received from people who allowed me to use their data for a webinar purpose. And so I did some analysis and I described the system. So it's a little more specific, but hopefully it'll help you kind of get a little bit of context on that. And then the full videos from those webinars are available on our webinar playlist on YouTube, and that's available to tier 2 members. So if you would like to view all of my previous webinar content, I've done multiple five-part webinar series on impedance spectroscopy, as well as RRDE and Levitch and Kentucky-Levitch, TAFL analysis, and then some those ones come from these webinars I did on, I call them advanced EIS fitting and circuit fitting kinds of techniques and analyses. So if you'd like those, you can become a tier 2 member for any period of time on our YouTube channel, and you can watch those videos if you'd like. Okay, so next I see Seth asks, what are my thoughts about gas phase amperometry for the use of NaAQS pollutants, detecting things like NO2 and ozone? Is it viable? So my hunch is to say no, that electrochemistry would be very tough at doing those things. It would have to be some specialized kind of sensor is my hunch. Electrochemistry specifically requires liquid or solid phase, and it requires a complete circuit, right? So if you have something that's trying to sense a gaseous reactant, right? Typically, it has to be dissolved in liquid in some capacity. Now, some gases dissolve in liquid at greater proportions than others, and then you sort of run into this problem that, of course, if it's like parts per million or parts per billion in the air, well, it's certainly not going to be in water or solvent at a very high rate either. And so what people will sometimes try to do, for example, is create an analogous or comparative kind of liquid system. So you try to get like the dissolved concentration at some rate that's comparable to what it is in air, but then you can measure it in a liquid system. And the reason for that is that you need electrolyte, right? You need to have ions that connect and create a circuit and complete the circuit between your electrodes. And so basically, if you have like an electrochemical sensor, it's not just one thing, right? Like even like a pH probe, like people don't often realize, for example, when you use a pH probe, you just dunk it in your solution and it tells you what the pH is. It's not one, it's actually 2 electrodes. It's measuring a voltage between them, and that correlates with the pH pretty easily. But it's 2 electrodes, and that's self-contained in a little bulb or something like that, depending on what it is. And it is its own liquid solution. Just electrodes, like in the air to measure, the concentration of ozone as a hazardous pollutant or something like that, would probably not work very well, because effectively the electrolyte is air, and air is a terrible dielectric. It's not going to conduct ionically to complete your circuit very well. And so you're basically just measuring the open circuit constantly. That's why you use like water with salt dissolved in it, because you have high ionic concentration to be able to complete that circuit. So there may be ways, for example, to have a self-contained system that allows diffusion of gas in at a small scale, and maybe it can detect it that way. But gas phase amperometry sounds tricky at the very least. And honestly, maybe there are references for it, or maybe it's been done and I'm just not aware. That's certainly possible. But I do doubt how effective it could be. Simply because electrochemistry usually requires a liquid phase, to complete a circuit and have this system, communicate appropriately. Okay, I see a couple of questions from Alexandra. So first is, how can I decide which catalyst is better for HER, hydrogen evolution reaction, based on LSV experiment and how to perform it? And then 2 is how to perform CO stripping. What is the basic theory of it? Okay. So if you're trying to decide, let me see here. I can try to illustrate something a little bit. Just get a blank kind of canvas to draw on. So I think that for doing hydrogen evolution reaction, there might be any number of techniques that are used. And just to be clear, LSV is one of them, but it may not be the only one. But if you're doing LSV and you have potential here and you have current here, right? So we're trying to do the hydrogen evolution reaction. I mean, the simplest answer I can give, first of all, about how to find, which catalyst is best or something like that is, let's say you test catalyst 1 and you're going to scan negatively, right? So you just start at some positive potential. Let's say this is, 0 current or something like that. And this is minus, X amps, whatever it is. And you start scanning negatively. Eventually it's going to increase or decrease, whichever your terminology is here, and you'll start getting current out, and that is presumably related to the hydrogen evolution. Okay, you're reducing and splitting water into hydrogen. Okay, now let's say I test catalyst 2 and I get this. Okay, now there's 2 types of analysis that you would use to compare these. First of all is, it's tricky to tell exactly where it is, but the first thing is, where is the onset potential, right? So this is onset potential, right? That is going to be an important quantity that will help you evaluate the effectiveness of your catalyst. Okay, so where the current, now this one's sort of gradual here, but right, where the current starts to dip down, sometimes it's very sharp and obvious where that is. Sometimes it's more gradual and it's hard to know, well, did it start here? Did it start here? Did it start here? It's hard to know. So sometimes there's benchmarks, for example, where the current was, 10 milliamps per centimeter squared or something like there'll be some what is the potential where I got a certain amount of current out, something like that. Okay. But where that potential starts is going to make a big difference, because that's how much energy you need to put in with that catalyst to get the hydrogen evolution reaction to occur, right? If this right here is, minus, it's going to depend on the pH and the reference electrode. I'm just making something up. Minus 500 millivolts. Okay, whatever. And this one here is minus 800 millivolts. Well, then from an onset potential perspective, it means that I need to apply 300 more millivolts of energy for catalyst 2 just to get the hydrogen evolution reaction to start occurring. And that's bad. That's less efficient. That's more energy I need. So in that case, number 1 is better than number 2. Now the other is, like I said, this particular current might be a thing. So I drew this on purpose where the green one is sort of sloping maybe, but the red one shoots really, really far down. Now this is a dramatic, I just made this up, right? So this isn't exactly perfectly accurate, let's just say. But another way to look at it is, okay, well, I have my onset potential. And then the other is that how much current am I getting out of my catalyst, right? Maybe this has a very bad onset potential, but I get a lot of current. And then, I see a couple of people asking why 10 milliamps. This number is just made up out of thin air, completely made up. I'm just coming up with an example. So to show you what I mean by that is, if this is my current axis here, and this is 0, and this is 10, minus 10, whatever. This is minus 20. I literally just pulled these numbers out of nowhere. This number is made up. So don't think about 10 milliamps or milliamp per centimeter squared as a specific meaning. I just pulled it out of absolutely nowhere. The point that I was making is that if you're comparing to literature, for example, sometimes what people will report is that they had like minus, again, all these numbers I'm making up, I'm totally making them up. I don't know if there's validity to these exact for this system, but someone might report something like, I got minus 10 milliamps per centimeter squared current density at, minus 600 millivolts, whatever, versus RHE or something like that. Okay. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out if this is a benchmark, again, just to compare with other people, with literature, what's better than what. You're trying to see, when do I get 10 milliamps of current, or milliamp per centimeter squared, whatever it is. Okay. So this catalyst does that. And this next catalyst that I test does that. And then this other catalyst that I test does this. Okay. So this one is best because that one, this is my potential axis, right? And so the further this way I go means the higher my over potential, which means more energy I have to put into the system. And so I'm trying to get this thing to drop, to start going down as soon as possible. And so the more I have to wait, thinking about it this way, for this to finally go down and get me the current that I'm interested in, any current, the more energy I have to put in, basically the worse the catalyst is. It means it's the worse. The catalyst isn't, the catalyst is supposed to decrease the activation energy to help drive the reaction of interest. And if it has a very high over potential and a very bad onset potential, then it's not doing a very good job at that reaction. And so, in this just made up example, that this would be the second best one for that onset potential. And then this would be the third best, right? So this is just, again, made up numbers totally, but there you go. That's kind of hopefully an okay illustration of some of the ways that you would judge with LSV, which catalyst is better than which one. And then you asked about CO stripping. What's the basic theory? Okay, I guess the way I would describe this is, carbon monoxide is a poison, right? So particularly to fuel cells and to platinum-based catalysts, things like that. So people are trying to determine its effect on performance. And so one of the things that you do is that you force carbon monoxide, you bubble it in solution or something like that, and you force the catalyst to get CO, and then you can detect its its impact on the electrocatalytic activity afterwards. Okay, so it's like CO is something that poisons a catalyst over time, and so you don't want it there. But the only way to really measure its impact is to intentionally poison, right? It's sort of a catch-22. You have to ruin your catalyst to see how the ruining proceeds, basically, right? So I think there's a number of ways to do this. For example, a stripping, I'm just going to look at our software here. So I don't know that I've done this particular experiment myself personally, but this is our software here. There's stripping experiments. So stripping voltammetry. So I'm just going to I'm going to see as well while I pull that up. I think maybe I could see if I possibly have a diagram of how it works. So sometimes what you can do is kind of just do cyclic voltammetry back and forth with CO. So you do cyclic voltammetry, for example, okay, and then you add CO and you see how it changes, and then you bubble. So it's like you could do let's see here. You do a cyclic voltammogram Okay. And that's like with nitrogen bubbled. And then you bubble CO and you see like some peak or something where the CO absorbs, whatever, it'll change. And then you bubble nitrogen again, and you see if it sort of returns to its, original, or it like starts to degrade somehow, or it changes. So that's one method, I think, or one sort of technique you can think about as sort of like you sort of before and after you've bubbled carbon monoxide in or not. I just want to check this quickly here if we have a stripping technique. Not sure I have a great like diagram of this stripping technique for you. Yeah, not quite. Not exactly what I'm looking for. Okay, so okay, but this stripping experiment, what do I get? You can see that we have there's what I described is as a cyclic voltammetry kind of experiment. That's sort of sweep and then bubble and then sweep and then bubble and sweep. But the other is a sort of a amperometric technique. So in this case, it's like you're applying a particular potential. So this says cleaning, deposition, and rest. So you apply a potential that will get the surface in a clean state. So like the CO2, the carbon monoxide, process will have some associated potential with it. And so if you're at a potential away from there, you can sort of clean the surface. And then you're going to apply a potential where the CO will absorb. And so you're adding it on to the surface. You get some current associated with that. And then this here has this, so there's a stripping period here. So you're going to, in this case, it is a sweep, a way to get that CO off. You'll have to pardon me because I don't have the most experience with this personally, but you're going to see basically some voltammetric response that is related to the removal of that. And so there's a correlation between the current that is associated with the deposition and then the stripping, but it's basically just a electrochemical way of putting that poison on the surface and then taking it off, putting it on, taking it off, that kind of a thing. And again, you're trying to see how intentionally how you can deactivate your catalyst with this poison by absorbing it and then stripping it off in a repeated fashion. I think that's the best that I can describe that as. I don't have any more personal experience, to be honest, with stripping techniques, but I hope that's at least a little bit helpful for you. Vinod asks, what is the role of electrolyte, acidic and basic, for electrolysis? So for HER, the hydrogen evolution reaction, if I use base electrolyte, it takes long voltage window to shoot current, and that time material is peeled off. So the first thing that I would say is that when you use, so the potentials at which electrochemical reactions occur shift based on pH, okay, by about 60 millivolts, minus 60 millivolts per pH unit. So this is a phenomenon, okay? So what that means is that if your pH is very high and you have a basic electrolyte, the potential at which the HER will happen is going to be lower. So if you're saying that it takes a long voltage window, perhaps what you might mean or be seeing is that high pH means that, compared to an acidic electrolyte, right? If you think about 14 pH units, right? 14 times 60 millivolts gives you 840 millivolts. So effectively, let's just say if some reaction if the HER happens in concentrated acid at 0 volts, then in concentrated base, that same reaction, depending on your reference electrode and all those kinds of things, will happen at roughly minus 800 millivolts. So it just pushes everything back. So that might be why you're seeing that it's, that's happening. And then, perhaps a consequence of this is that you have to apply such a negative potential in that environment to get the reaction to occur that you're actually starting to reduce or dramatically affect your catalyst itself, because it's experiencing the same potential as you try to make it happen. And then the other thing is that, frankly, it might not be an effective HER catalyst, because it's like that onset potential that I talked about before. If there is a very poor onset potential, if it takes a really long time for it to start going down, well, then you have to keep pushing the potential out to get that to start dropping. And that, coupled with the fact that at high pH, it's pushing everything more negative anyway, then it's probably not working in your favor there. And there's definitely a lot of specifics. I know some, I don't, know every detail, to be perfectly honest, but like some, you can do the oxygen reduction reaction, you can do the hydrogen evolution, oxygen evolution in both acid and base. Some of those processes are better or worse in alkaline or acidic, right? It kind of just depends. Some catalysts perform the reaction, better or more efficiently in alkaline than in acidic, or vice versa. So you might just have some phenomena there that, some combination of your material, that's tricky there. And yeah, I see your follow-up comment is that the material is stable in base and it dissolves in acid. So for HER, what do you do? Well, I think also if the material is peeling off, I would have you check the method that you are preparing your catalyst itself. So, if you're doing a thin film on like a glassy carbon disc electrode, if you're drop casting onto carbon paper, or a carbon cloth, if your Dr. Blade method or spray coating something, you might have to work on some of those kinds of less electrochemical reasons and more arts and crafts, right? Because the adhesion of, again, this is hard for me to know just based on what you're saying here, but why it's peeling off could be a combination of the electrochemistry, but also just some sort of physical physisorption kinds of things that, different formulations of your ink or of a thin film. Okay. Yeah. So that is a very notoriously difficult kind of process. It really, like I said, it kind of ends up being more arts and crafts almost than anything. I'm going to send you, if you're not aware of this one, there's a researcher named Yannick Garcini, who is a friend of mine at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., in the U.S. I want to link a paper by Yannick. So that's Yannick Garcini, spell his name properly, Garcini thin film. So again, you're probably seeing that as you hear me say this. He is a researcher, as I said. He has a lot of papers that are just on the formation of the thin films, like the technique itself, which surprisingly and unfortunately can affect the electrochemical data more than we wish it would, right? It would be wonderful if it didn't have quite an effect, because that's just a procedural thing. That's not even so much of like studying the electrochemistry. It's like, well, my film isn't perfect or something. So there are formulations. When you make your thin film, you have to make your ink. Usually you use something like Nafion. It's trickier in alkaline. You don't always want to use Nafion for alkaline because, well, it's Naphion is a proton exchange ionomer, but you need that glue to keep your stuff on the disc electrode. I actually used Naphion when I did this in graduate school, and I did alkaline electrochemistry. So I do have some experience with this. It does work. It's not ideal, but if you have another ionomer you can use, you can check and make sure that your film is adhering very well, because extreme conditions can cause it to delaminate or fall off. And so that could be a reason that is somewhat disconnected from the perhaps from the electrochemistry that you're doing. And especially if you are, as you said, basically required to use base because your catalyst isn't really stable or dissolves in acidic media. Okay, so next, Shamsuddin says, can I talk about the conversion of potential between reference electrodes? Sure. Let me pull up one of these handy little charts that we have. So converting between reference electrodes, I would just say, generally speaking, and actually I'll answer the next question you said also, is the NHE the same as SHE? Yeah, it is. So NHE is normal hydrogen electrode and SHE is standard hydrogen electrode. They're used interchangeably. There might be some small semantic difference that I'm not totally aware of. Like one of them might be specifically related to, like with a 1 molar sulfuric acid or something. Anyway, for all intents and purposes, they're the same. If you see someone reporting in a paper something versus NHE or something versus SHE or RHE, those are all basically the same thing. So you can take those all as the same. Converting between reference electrodes is really just simple arithmetic. I'm going to pull up document. My company sells reference electrodes. And so one of the common things is, of course, converting between them. Let me just find reference electrode. Let's see, can I find one? As a general rule of thumb, reference electrodes, there it is. Reference electrodes have a standard, most reference electrodes, I should say, like especially most like aqueous reference electrodes, have standard potentials that are some positive amount of millivolts, somewhere between like 100 and 600 or 700 millivolts. And so as a general rule of thumb, when you're converting from RHE, NHE, SHE, whatever, to the reference electrode, you're taking away a number. So like 0 versus NHE is minus 200 versus silver chloride. You're going to subtract the number. Let me share this chart with you. This is from one of the document inserts. This one. This is a document insert for one of our reference electrodes. It's the silver chloride one. This table is the one to bring your attention to. So this is a pretty useful table. So you can see these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different reference couples basically. So if you want to go from any of these to any of the same ones, that's the conversion value. So for example, if you want to go from silver chloride to NHE, you add 200, 199. Okay. And typically that's why people are usually doing, right, that you're setting up your electrochemical experiment. You're using your silver chloride reference or your mercury sulfate or your calomel, right? And you measure your potentiostat, just gives you your voltammogram, and you have a voltage and a current axis. And then typically you want to convert it to NHE or SHE or RHE afterwards to compare with literature. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes people will just leave their voltammogram, volts versus AgCl or versus SCE. That's also acceptable. But if you want to convert, for example, from calomel to NHE, all that means is, you have your, if you have your voltammogram here, I'll just sort of draw this over here, and you get your, Alex is a much better artist than me, so pardon me. Right, here's my voltammogram, And this is the potential axis. And my potentiostat just reported this. This is actually versus SCE, because that's the reference electrode that I had connected to the potentiostat. So if I want to convert this to E versus NHE, right? I want to go from SCE here to NHE. So this is my intersection. So I have to add 240. So basically, I'm just going to add 241 millivolts to every point. And so I'm just going to end up with, I can draw, I'm a terrible artist. So it's like, looks so bad. That's supposed to be the same curve. So bear with me here. But anyway, that would be what you're doing. You're just moving it on over, right? You're adding it everything, and that effectively shifts the axis. And this goes the same for converting between anything else. So, I mean, if I wanted to convert from, I mean, you can read the chart here yourself, but if I want to convert from calomel and I'm trying to compare with someone who used mercury sulfate, right? Well, I just go from here all the way down to here. And if I take away instead, let's use a different color. If I instead take away 409 millivolts, now I've converted this to E versus, it's, you know, mercury to SO for mercury sulfate. So I can make that conversion. So it's just arithmetic. It's just all of these standard potentials based on the Nernst equation have a set standard value of potential, and you're just adding or subtracting to get to that value. And basically, each of these, this, I'll say, let's see, this row right here is kind of like a list for these four in particular: mercury oxide, that's one for alkaline, silver chloride, calomel, and mercury sulfate. Basically 100, 200, 240, and 650. These are the standard, if you sort of look them up, like what's the standard reference potential for each of these reference electrodes. These are the values. So when you're correcting to one of them, you're basically subtracting that number. That's the procedure. From wherever you are to this, you're in some ways you're subtracting the number there. Now from NHE, it's with respect to 0, so it's always just this number. But that's why going from SCE to that, it's like subtracting the difference between the two. So anyway, this table is also helpful if you just want to get the answers right away. And there's also some, like online, you can like Google like reference electrocalculator. There's some websites that you can type in one and whatever. If you're sort of unsure, like, oh, does it go up or does it go down? And I actually sometimes I'll have that moment, you know, have a brain, you know, moment where I'm like, wait, do I go up 200 or down 200? You have to kind of like remind yourself. So hopefully that's helpful. Okay, it looks like Sumita says, what is the pre-electrolysis process? Okay, so I think I got this question. Maybe we got this question last week. I'll try to explain this again. This is a good question. So, for example, in my company's software, you might see this explained in different ways. Pre-electrolysis for my company software calls it like induction time. So let's say you're doing chronoamperometry. So you're going to apply at some time some potential, and you're going to measure the resulting current. Okay, well, if this is my time 0, right here, and just put time. Okay, and so this is time 0. If I start applying some potential, I'm going to probably have something that looks like this. This is basically the Cottrell equation, right? You're going to have some kind of a decay or some, you know, process. Now this, you know, sort of flattening out decay how long that takes will depends on the time constant, depends on what's happening. This could be a microsecond. It could be super fast. You don't even see it. This could be a millisecond, or it could be a second. Well, if it's a microsecond, who cares? Probably, right? It's probably so fast you don't care. But if it's a second, or if it's 10 seconds or something, well, then it can start to affect things. If that's what you're trying to measure, fine. But let's say you're not doing let's say you're doing cyclic voltammetry, or LSV, right? Well, if you're doing cyclic voltammetry, and I'm starting here, and I want to measure, my CV, I'm gonna try to draw it better this time. Okay, great. And then I, get back to where I started. But if what happens is at the beginning, I have some decay period, then, reality, what I might get is this, and this will happen pretty often if you do CV. Now, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Okay, so you have this little tail here. Okay, well, it's maybe you cycle twice through, and the second time you don't have that. Okay, fine. But this is what sometimes a pre-electrolysis period can do, is that you sort of, instead of sort of starting at time, well, anywhere you start is time zero, if you think about it, but let's just pretend that we're starting here instead. So I start and I give it, 3 seconds or something like that. So it's almost like minus 3 seconds. I know I'm talking about negative time, which makes no sense at all. But let's say I don't want to see this feature. I just want to get, from here on, or for my CV. Well, I can apply the set potential for a few seconds and let that drown itself, like finish that decay, settles into its steady state. And then I get to my data that I'm interested in. And so sometimes that's this kind of induction pre-electrolysis will help you kind of get the electrode into a steady condition, and it can eliminate this sort of tail kind of behavior for you. And that can be a helpful thing in some of those cases. So I hope that clears that up for you. Okay, so I think that, to be honest, I don't see any other pressing questions at the moment. So if that's the case, I think we can probably wrap this up, and I'll wait just a few minutes in case somebody else does have something that they want to ask. And there's noting a little bit of a delay here, so want to give enough time just in case somebody is typing. But if there are no other questions, I guess I will say thank you to everybody who joined me today and who posted questions in the days leading up to this event. And as I said, we are trying to do this kind of live stream every week on this time and on Fridays. And so whether it's me or it's my colleague Alex or both of us, we will definitely try to continue having these sessions if people are interested and show up and have questions. Okay, I do see one quick question here by Shamsuddin, who's, how do we pre-treat the working electrodes before real testing? It depends on the system that you're doing. So one of the things that people do is like cleaning CVs. So like if you're doing platinum and acid, you'll basically just cycle over like any number of times, 20 times, 50 times at a relatively fast scan rate, maybe like 100 millivolts per second. So you can just scan back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That'll sort of activate the surface. It'll clean the surface. That's one way of sort of getting junk off the surface, if you will. You know, when you do something like that and you scan, you know, you'll see sometimes like you scan or whatever, and then it'll start to almost trace on itself. And then, you know, maybe the first time you had this little peak somewhere of some contaminant, and then the next scan it was a little lower, and then it was a little lower, it was lower, and then it eventually settles in. So sometimes that's really what you do, is you just do a CV, like, you know, 20 times back and forth, or even up to 100 times or 50 times. It'll depend. Sometimes you just do it until it perfectly traces on itself. And that's a way of sort of verifying that your surface is pretty pristine. But that's a general advice of how to pre-treat the surface. The other is, a pre-electrolysis period. Like I said, letting your electrode sit at some stable potential for a period of time before you start your test. That can be an effective way to do that. But otherwise it really will depend on the system that you're doing, that you're testing. But generally speaking, some cyclic voltammograms to get a stable, repeatable trace on itself is a decent way to kind of test that the electrode surface is in good condition. Okay, so like I said, I'm glad. Thank you for the last minute question here. I'm going to wrap it up and thank everybody for joining me today. If you're watching this afterwards, thank you for watching as well. Please feel free to leave a comment in the comments on the video, and we'll try to answer those. And otherwise, we'll see you next week, and have a great weekend, everybody.